In this Aetherdrift Draft Meta update, I'll be providing you with the most up-to-date information on the format so you can crush your next draft. First up, the format news, and our first headline is Welcome to 2025. Vanilla creatures, which means creatures with no abilities, are back, and they are huge in this format, which is just an indication of the power level you are going to be dealing with. Jabiric Omnivore is just a 2-mana 3/2, straight up. Sundial, 2-mana 3/3. Kalorna is a 2-mana 0/8. That is a lot of power and toughness you are going to have to deal with, and while this might seem scary in terms of the output of damage that they can provide, it's more so just an indicator of the power level you should be looking for in all of your cards, because these cards are solid but nothing crazy in this format, which is telling you something about the power level of the cards you are going to be playing in your decks. Just get ready for it, because you don't want to be opening your first pack, seeing this sort of card and being like, oh my gosh, I have to take this card is way better than everything I've ever seen. Just be patient, look at all the cards, and make sure that you take the best one for your deck. Next, slow and steady wins the race. There are a lot of themes in this set, and in particular, the start your engines mechanic makes it sound like you really want to attack your opponent, get up to max speed quickly, but a lot of the successful decks, and the most successful decks in this format, have been these slower, grindier decks. Blue-green and black-green in particular are a cut above the rest, and they have been really great in terms of getting to the late game and getting that value from their cards that lets them pull ahead of their competition. Sky Serpent Seeker and Thundering Broodwagon are really great uncommons for these strategies, and even decks like Blue-Black Stall Control with cards like Haunt the Network as finishers to just deal a bunch of damage once you've stalled the board have been quite successful. So keep an eye out for these cards and don't get lured in by the cult of speed. Next, it's good to be green. These cards, these commons, have been absolutely fantastic in green and really tie together a lot of decks. Run Over is great removal. Stampeding Scurryfoot is a nice utility creature early that gets you a bunch of stats into play, split across multiple bodies. And Migrating Ketrodon is a great top-end card at common that even has cycling early, so that it is not going to be a terrible card in your opening hand. There's a lot more good green cards that I wasn't able to highlight, but overall, green is a great place to be in this format, so lean towards it when you are drafting. Moving on to the meta market, and first up is our archetype rankings. At number 1 is Black-Green Graveyard Value. This deck just fills the graveyard with cards, has some recursion elements, and also just has a ton of value and 2-for-1s built in, so you can outgrind your opponents in the late game. Right up there with it is Blue-Green Exhaust Ramp. There's a lot of ways to spend your mana in the late game with these exhaust abilities on your cards, and blue-green has not only a high density of those, but also good tools for getting to the late game with stall cards, and even has some decent removal this time around, which is great. Next is Red-Green Exhaust Midrange. So this is a deck that can be a little bit more aggressive thanks to the red cards, but also, as you'll notice, the common trend, green, is in this deck, and green has a really great late game in this deck because of a lot of its exhaust cards, because of things like the Ketrodon, which we looked at, and this card can play a little bit of an earlier game, but then uses those exhaust abilities to pull through the late game situations where it might have run out of things to spend its mana on otherwise. Next is Green-White Mount Midrange. This card once again leverages the powerful green cards. You'll notice all 4 color combinations involving green, top 4 this time around. And this one just gets some of the cards from the mounts in this set, so like cards that are creatures but can be saddled up for extra value, sometimes get a little bit better in this deck because of a couple of synergy pieces, but generally you're just going to be playing the strong green cards, supplementing them with the white cards that you see if those colors happen to be open. There's also some pretty good uncommons that are multicolored for this deck. The next is Blue-Black Stall Control. We did mention that this is a deck that can actually thrive in this format. You have the tools to stabilize the board and then take over the late game, which is just what Blue-Black is looking for. Black in particular has some fantastic removal spells this time around, and there's plenty of cards that get you value in this set. Next is Red-Black Max Speed Aggro. You'll notice the first kind of aggressive deck is down here in the 6th slot here. And this deck really does leverage a lot of the best cards that red and black have to offer that are aggressively slanted. They don't necessarily fit into the more controlling strategies very well, but the aggressive cards do have a home, and it is max speed aggro if you are trying to go fast, and there are some really powerful uncommons for this strategy as well. Next is Blue-Red Cycling Aggro. This deck can also play more of a mid-rangey role, but there are some cards that can be absolutely terrifying in the early game if you are able to support them, like the Mako, and there's also a Skyray that does some serious work where whenever you discard a card, they get +1/+1 counters, and then you're looking for recursive ways to discard cards to fuel your engines, build up your creatures early, attack your opponents, and do all of that good stuff. There is also some benefit to getting a little bit more into the mid stages of the game because you have some discard outlets that potentially let you get through your land drops and make sure you don't draw too many lands in the mid stages of the game. So cycling aggro can also be a little bit more of a cycling mid-range deck. Next is Blue-White Artifact Control. This deck can go into the late game. It uses some cards that no other decks are interested in, which is an advantage because it lets you get the good cards for your deck a little bit later, because if it's an artifact payoff card or an artifact enabler, other decks just simply aren't going to be able to use it as effectively, which means you're going to be able to get your Blue-White Artifact Control a lot more good pieces later. Unfortunately, there's not as many good pieces as some of the other decks have available, so you are going to be leveraging and relying on that a little bit more to make sure you have a powerful deck. Next is White-Black Max Speed Grind. So this is a deck that tries to get up to max speed and then has some more grindy elements that rely on having max speed. It's just a little bit hard to get to max speed in this format, especially because the White-Black deck is just not as good at doing it as the Red-Black deck. And so it might be harder to enable your payoffs, though there are some strong reasons to try and do that. And finally is Red-White Vehicle Aggro. The cards in this strategy are just too underpowered to make this a good quality deck in the format. It's actually quite a bit weaker than even the second to last place deck of Max Speed Grind. And this is actually one of those archetypes that you're going to try to avoid unless it is overwhelmingly open and you're getting every single uncommon that you want for your deck, because at the common level, this deck is really not supported very well. Next up is the color rankings. As you probably guessed, green coming in at number 1. Hopefully, I have been emphasizing a lot how good green is, so you'll make sure to prioritize it in your next draft. Black coming in at number 2. Great removal, great value cards. Really so many just high-powered level cards that also slot really well into the decks you want to draft. Blue coming in next in the color ranking. Just a really solid color, has some card advantage, has some pretty solid removal this time around. Good interaction, good late game, just what you expect from blue. Next is red. It has a little bit less depth at common. It's only got a couple of commons that are really premium to draft for your decks. And then after that, it kind of relies on higher rarity cards and also just synergies with the other colors. So like some of the red cards are really good in the blue-red cycling deck, but not particularly good in other decks, that sort of thing. And then finally, white coming in last. It just has a much lower card quality than the rest of the colors, and especially at the lower rarities, doesn't have a ton of cards that really incentivize you to go into white, though it does have some synergy packages that you might want to draft at times, like the blue-white artifact deck we mentioned does have some white cards that really shine there, and similarly, like white-green has some really good uncommons as well that are like gold cards that can maybe make you want to draft the color. Next up is the format speed. It is definitely on the slower side. Definitely a contributing factor is that white and red are the weaker colors in this format, and also the fact that there are good tools to stabilize. Green has some life gain built in with the Ketradon and things like that, which all contribute to making the format slower. So grindy cards are valuable, but you still need to make sure you're impacting the board early, because you don't want to just get taken down by your opponent playing these giant statted creatures like we already discussed, like the 2025 style cards that are just bigger than you might expect in a typical limited format from times past. So make sure you have the stat lines that you need to use, the cards early to make sure you don't get run over, but the games tend to go on for quite some time where value does matter a lot. Moving on to some sleeper cards, Nicolai's sleepers. And first up is Scrap Compactor. This is a totally serviceable card that kind of gets disrespected a lot of the time, but 1 mana you just can get this into play a lot of the time without having it impact your curve too much. And then in the mid game, you're going to be able to take out powerful 3 toughness creatures like a Boom Scholar before it really does anything too scary. Or in the late game, you can even take out huge creatures like we already discussed that are just giant and you need to have answers to them, and Scrap Compactor can do that if your deck does not have interaction. It's not the greatest interaction in the world, and you're not going to try to play tons of copies of it, but it's definitely a card you can play a copy of without blinking an eye, and I've done that many times, and it's definitely the sort of card that oftentimes players just ignore completely, and I don't think that should be done. Next is Midnight Mangler. This card is really, really good stats early game for defense. So 2 mana, 3/3, it just shuts down aggro completely. And this is the sort of thing that I was talking about with why the format can be slow, is because if someone drops a Midnight Mangler, your little 2/2 attackers aren't really going to be doing a ton against it. And then even in the mid game, you can start crewing it up on your turn to start attacking your opponent. This card really enables powerful card advantage engines like Hull Drifter. So 5 mana, draw some cards, get another vehicle into play. Really supported well by having an early game massive creature that can just roadblock your opponents, and also something like Sabotage Strategist with an expensive exhaust ability. You want to get to that late game, and Midnight Mangler helps you do that by just giving you a lot of stats that give you the time to activate your exhaust abilities. There, I've got kind of a summary sheet here featuring some more information in top commons, but also just the archetype ranks, color rankings, format speed, as just a nice little summary of the things you should be looking for in this format. And as well, on the Patreon for NicolaiBolas, there's a free PDF version of this sheet. You don't need to be a patron to access it. It's just a nice little place to put PDFs so that you'll have access to them if you want. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy it, remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, and comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. And to let me know you made it to the end, leave hashtag DriftMaster in the comments section down below. That's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.